The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is David Ainsworth. I'm the Information Officer at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Let me welcome you to this event, The Road from Sharm El-Sheikh to Kunming, Restoration in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This high-level panel marks the launch of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and is hosted by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the governments of Egypt and China, and the Korea Forest Service. Before we begin, I'm just going to invite all participants to submit questions or comments if you wish during that session in the Q&A function in the control panel. When you do ask your questions, please introduce yourself and the organization you represent and a contact email. We'll take note of your questions and discuss them in the Q&A session as time allows. In case we don't have time to address all the questions, we will make sure to get back with a response via email. We will start our event today with two keynote addresses from, first of all, Her Excellency, Dr. Yasmin Fouad, the Minister of Environment of Egypt, and from His Excellency, Mr. Huang Rongqiu, Minister of Ecology and Environment of the People's Republic of China, respectively. Owing to prior commitments, both ministers could not join us in person and have shared their valuable insights virtually through video presentations. So, without further ado, let us begin. I invite you to join me and listen to the remarks from Her Excellency, Dr. Yasmin Fouad, the Minister of Environment of Egypt and the President of the CBD COP14.
Good morning, good afternoon. Degradation affects a large part of the planet and must be addressed urgently. The latest IPBES global assessment stated that the 3/4 of the Earth's land surface has been destroyed and that more than 85% of our wetland has been destroyed as well. And we've dedicated 1/3 of all land and 75% of the available fresh water to crops and livestock production. There is a cost for land degradation, but that cost has reached almost 490 billion per year globally. And this cost is much more higher than the cost of the action to prevent. The linkages between climate change and biodiversity is huge. Land and ecosystem restoration increases carbon storage as well as avoids greenhouse gases. And this would definitely lead into most effective approaches for greenhouse gas mitigation that's required by 2030 and to keep the global warming below the 2 degrees. There is opportunities that we can look off by restoring our ecosystem. Increased employment, increased business spending, improve the gender equality, and increase the local investment in education, as well as improving the livelihood of all people. Egypt, through its presidency of the COP, has made sure that there is a balanced, fair, post-2020 biodiversity framework. And we will continue working on ecosystem restoration through implementation and research. I would like to welcome the launch of the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration as a useful platform for exchange of experiences and awareness raising, and would like in that regard to congratulate the FAO and the UNEP as leads to this process. Finally, I wish China the best of luck as the next COP president to begin the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and would like to ensure the continued commitment and support of Egypt towards that process. Thank you.
We thank Dr. Fouad, firstly, for her excellent steering of the current CBD COP presidency, and also for her inspiring words, highlighting the importance of restoration for developing a fair and balanced post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We also thank her for recognizing the role of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration in raising awareness on restoration issues. We will now continue with the keynote intervention from His Excellency, Mr. Huang Rongqiu, the Minister of Ecology and Environment of the People's Republic of China and the host government of CBD COP15.
尊敬的亚塞敏·福尔德女士、崔炳安先生、伊丽莎白·穆雷马女士、女士们、先生们、朋友们，非常感谢秘书处伊丽莎白·穆雷马执行秘书的邀请，与埃及、韩国共同举办这次非常有意义的活动。我愿意与大家一道，共同探讨全球生态系统保护与恢复问题，推动在2020年后全球生物多样性框架中建立高水平的政治动力，提高全球生态系统恢复的雄心。生态系统的保护修复是生物多样性公约的重要议题。中国与国际社会共同努力，把生态系统恢复纳入到国家和地方中长期发展规划。艾滋目标恢复15%的生态系统的目标持续推进。森林、草原、荒漠、湿地生态系统保护修复都取得了显著成效。一是中国通过开展天然林保护、退耕还林还草、退牧还湿、山北防护林建设、山水林田湖草沙一体化保护和修复等重大工程，全国森林覆盖率达到了23.04%，草原综合植被盖度达到了56.1%，全国沙化土地面积实现零增长。二是中国通过建立生态保护红线制度，加大陆域25%以上生态空间保护的力度，其中各类自然保护地占国土面积的18%，90%的典型生态系统类型，85%的重点野生动物种群和65%的高等植物群落得到了严格保护。三是中国全面恢复水生生态系统，全国湿地保护率达到52%以上。自2021年起，在长江等重点水域实施为期10年的禁渔计划，实施海洋伏季休渔制度，加大海洋的生态系统修复力度。当前生态系统在全球范围内持续退化，土地退化、物种丧失和气候变暖的趋势尚未得到有效的遏制，严重阻碍了全球减贫、水资源健康等可持续发展目标的实现。由此造成的生物多样性和生态系统服务损失每年约占世界 GDP 的10%。面对全球生态环境治理的严峻形势，国际社会要以前所未有的雄心和行动，探索人与自然和谐共生之路，像保护眼睛一样保护自然和生态环境，让良好的生态系统成为全球经济社会可持续发展的支撑。女士们、先生们，2021年是联合国生态系统恢复10年倡议的开局之年 ，COP15 也将于10月在中国昆明召开。COP15 将总结过去10年全球生物多样性保护工作进展，制定2020年后全球生物多样性框架。一个兼具雄心和务实的2020年后全球生物多样性框架，将给生态系统的恢复迎来新的机遇。作为 COP15 的主席国，我们愿与国际社会一道，大力推动框架的进程，认真落实联合国生态系统恢复10年计划，努力在未来10年扭转生物多样性丧失的趋势，并在其后的20年保护完好的生态系统，恢复受损的生态系统，增强生态系统的完整性， 连通性和韧性，为实现公约到2050年与自然和谐相处的愿景做出我们的贡献。为此我提议，一要将生态系统恢复放在政策制定的中心位置，加大公共和私营部门为自然融资的力度，推动资源向生态系统恢复流动。二是要增加生态系统恢复的系统性，坚持山水林田湖草沙是生命共同体的理念，整体保护、系统修复、综合治理、统筹规划、一体化实施。三要提高生态系统恢复的质量，充分考虑生态系统分布区域特点，坚持自然恢复为主、人工修复干预为辅的原则，宜草则草，宜林则林，宜荒则荒，不断提高生态系统恢复的质量和韧性。第四是要建立多元化的资源调动机制，生态系统是公共的生态产品，坚持政府投入主渠道不变的前提下，要鼓励私营部门、社会资本的投入。五是要加强国际合作，发挥里约3公约的作用，积极响应联合国生态系统恢复10年倡议，充分调动政治资源，在实现疫后绿色复苏过程中，实现制止和扭转生态系统退化的目标。女士们、先生们，作为 COP15的东道国，中国将积极参与全球生态系统保护和恢复，与各方一道，携手共进，相向而行，共启全球生物多样性治理的新进程，共建人与自然和谐的地球生命共同体。谢谢大家。
We thank His Excellency, Mr. Huang Rongqiu, for highlighting the importance of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and we welcome the incoming presidency for leading the integration of restoration in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome to this special event for the launch of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, organized by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the governments of Egypt and China, and the Korean Forest Service. I'll just remind all of you again, the event is in English only with some subtitles. If you wish to ask questions, please put them in the chat box. Please introduce yourself and your organization's name and include an email address so we can answer your question by email if we're not able to get to it immediately. We'll continue with our program now, and it's now my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Rema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Dear Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies Dr. Faut, as well as His Excellency Minister Ruki have made it clear the importance of ecosystem restoration. But let me first welcome you all to this high-level event to mark the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And again, sincerely, I would like to thank the government of Egypt, government of China, and the Korea Forest Service for co-hosting this session today in conjunction with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In this context, I would like to make just few following points. We are witnessing unprecedented times. The negative trend of land degradation continue to reach high levels in many parts of the world. We are losing more value than we produce. Between 1997 to 2011, land use change caused losses averaging $20 trillion worth of ecosystems services every year. Land degradation alone accounted for 30% of this figure. That is 3 times the global market value of agricultural products. Changes due to ecosystem and land degradation are negatively impacting the well-being of at least 3.2 billion people and costing more than 10% of the annual global gross product in loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The socioeconomic imbalances created during this pandemic have further worsened the situation of millions of people dependent on these precious land and natural resources for food and livelihood security. Therefore, investing in land and ecosystem restoration makes ecological, social, and economic sense. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services makes a strong economic case for investing while avoiding land degradation and restoring degraded land, as the benefits generally far exceeds the cost. Research shows that every dollar spent on restoration, between $3 to $75 of economic benefits from ecosystem goods and services can be expected. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration provides an opportunity to further integrate our efforts to address cross-cutting issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation, all intrinsically linked to the objectives of the 3 Rio Conventions, as well as to the Sustainable Development Goals. With the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration laying the foundation, this must be the decade for action and restoration. The transitions needed for ecosystem restoration require building technical capacity, strengthening regional, national, and subnational policy governance and institutional mechanisms. Furthermore, investing in research, building synergies in cross-sectorial policies, setting the right incentives, catalyzing actions on the ground, unlocking and reorienting finance, ensuring accountability, and finally, empowering a global movement will be indispensable. We must check all the boxes to achieve the transformation we need. The Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, implemented by the CBD Secretariat and supported by the Korea Forest Service, aims to support countries' capacity for planning and implementing ecosystem restoration as part of their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. This initiative sets a robust example for mobilizing knowledge, resources, and enhancing capacities for achieving the restoration agenda. Ecosystem restoration is certainly expected to feature predominantly in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be adopted later this year. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, led by the United Nations Environment Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization, in collaboration with the Rio Conventions and other partners, will provide the needed, much needed platform to scale up and scale out the necessary actions. Let's make use of this opportunity and dedicate our efforts towards ecosystem restoration, an essential element of restoring balance with nature. Thank you.
I thank Executive Secretary Elizabeth Mrema for highlighting the ecological, social, and economic importance of ecosystem restoration and the importance of integrating ecosystem restoration in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Let me now introduce our next speaker, who will also be joining us virtually through a video message, His Excellency, Mr. Choi Byung-am, Minister of the Korea Forest Service.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. I am Byung-am Choi, Minister of the Korea Forest Service. I'm greatly honored and pleased to speak at this very meaningful event today. Every country has been suffered serious impact of COVID-19 for over a year. However, behind this, we are faced with bigger challenges, climate crisis and biodiversity loss. To tackle such challenges, the world is making concerted efforts and particularly highlighting the importance of forest ecosystem restoration as a key nature-based solution. In this context, the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration from 2021 to 2030 is very timely, and I'm certain that this will be a necessary policy direction toward achieving living in harmony with nature, which is the Convention's vision for 2050. Koreans are aware of painful consequences of forest degradation and importance of forest restoration better than anyone else. Restoring degraded lands was a top priority of Korea after the Korean War ended in 1953. As part of the efforts, the Korean government created a dedicated department for forest and reforested the country with all Koreans. Thanks to the nationwide efforts, Korea earned a global reputation as a successful role model of forest restoration while achieving economic growth. Based on this experience, Korea proposed the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, or FERI, at the CBD COP12 held in Pyeongchang, Korea in 2014. To support the regions suffering from forest degradation, and to date, FERI has been successfully implemented in close collaboration with the CBD Secretariat. FERI aims to help developing countries build capacity of restoration, provide them with technical assistance, and support the implementation of restoration projects in those countries. Through FERI projects, Korea has supported 12 countries in forest restoration since 2015, and the smart restoration target has been formally established thanks to FERI. The Korean government essentially hopes to see FERI further developed through stronger cooperation between the Korea Forest Service and the CBD Secretariat, building on discussion outcomes of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Last but not least, Korea will host the 15th World Forestry Congress, the largest and most influential gathering in forestry from 2nd to 6th May 2022 in Quebec, Seoul, in partnership with FAO. Certainly, the Congress will offer an opportunity to discuss how the outcomes of the CBD COP15 in October this year can be applied in the field of forestry. I hope that today's event will be crucial momentum for global ecosystem restoration within the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I wish all of you a fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
We thank Mr. Choi Byung-am for highlighting the role of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration in shaping the policy roadmap of ecosystem restoration and for the extensive support from the Korea Forest Service to the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative in achieving the goals of the restoration agenda. We also note with anticipation the hosting of the World Forestry Congress by the Republic of Korea in May of 2022. I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Mr. Bernardo Strasbourg. He is the founder and executive director of the International Institute for Sustainability, or IIS, in Rio. He is also the coordinator of the Center for Conservation and Sustainability Science. He is an assistant professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio and a professor at the Professional Master in Sustainability Science. Bernardo is an economist with a MSc in environmental planning, which focused on land use change and ecosystem services in the Amazon, and also a PhD in environmental sciences. He's much published, and his work is dedicated to the transition to sustainability with a focus on the sustainable use of land and its resources, conciliating production needs, environmental services and social development, through interdisciplinary research and assisting governments, NGOs, and private companies. Bernardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. His Excellencies, Madam Executive Secretary, it's an immense pleasure to be here. I'm here to present the research we perform in support of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, focused on ecosystem restoration and the ramifications it had for the current draft. Since 2013, at the International Institute for Sustainability, we've been working to develop a platform, a decision support tool called Plangeia, to support decision makers in maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks and trade-offs and costs of ecosystem restoration. This platform should have three important elements: integrate multiple criteria chosen by decision makers or stakeholders in a specific place or region. It should be precise, able to identify exact solutions to the problems chosen, the objectives chosen, and should also be able to measure the outcomes in units that speak to decision makers, that can be compared, and the trade-offs can be clarified. We use Plangeia. I won't go through all the steps, I think highlighting here, just that our methodology starts and ends with people. And in the middle, there is all the mathematical modeling. Now, as part of the first global analysis of restoration for priority areas or different benefits, we developed, in support of this post-2020 CBD process, we identified 2.9 billion hectares of converted lands. We focus on multiple species and carbon sequestration. We also included agriculture as a way of avoiding potential conflicts. And crucially, we focus on all ecosystem types. It was a major collaborative effort with individuals and institutions across the globe, led by the International Institute for Sustainability. The reason for this is that ecosystem restoration provides multiple benefits, but also incurs potentially in costs. And these vary tremendously in space. So identifying areas where these can be jointly optimized for benefits and cost avoidance will increase restoration success and its positive impacts. It's important to note that this is a global scale exercise. And as a global spatial prioritization exercise goes, they can be relatively good at incorporating biophysical and some financial units that don't change across scale. But these must be complemented by exercise at finer scales, both where social, economic, and cultural variables can be better incorporated, but also stakeholders can be properly included in a due and fair process. The products of this research was published in the journal Nature a few months ago, and it was extensively covered by the international media as part of this restoration momentum. As I mentioned before, a crucial element is that we managed to include all major ecosystem types into this analysis, going beyond a focus on forests. And without further ado, this is our first map of priority areas for biodiversity. When you think about restoring with a focus only on biodiversity, and here the focus was on avoiding species extinctions. The areas in red are the top priorities around the globe, and then they decrease in priorities orange, yellow, green, and blue. As we can see, there are areas of priorities all around the globe. They are concentrated, as expected, in biodiversity hotspots that have lost a substantial part of their area. But we found top priority areas in all latitudes, ranging from the Baltic Islands to Tierra del Fuego. If we focus on carbon, these would be the priority areas for restoration. As we can see, they mostly focus, as expected, on forests, and you can see here on the map very clearly, but also wetlands are highlighted. Again, distributed primarily in tropical forests, but also other high biomass forests across the globe. If we were to focus on minimizing potential conflicts with agriculture, focus on areas where agricultural productivity is lower, which is just one aspect that we could focus. The areas in red, which tend to be drylands, would be prioritized. But probably what we want to do is focus on all of the above and others simultaneously. A crucial aspect of what we developed is that we are able to do this at the same time, and optimizing for multiple benefits and avoidance of costs is different than optimizing for them individually. As we can see here, again, we have a distribution mostly focused on tropical regions, but again, with priority areas extending all across the globe. One crucial aspect of the work, perhaps the most important insight we found, is the importance of where. Massive differences in outcomes can be achieved for the same restoration target. So for the same restored area, as an example here on this graph, if we were to restore 5% of the world, we could achieve anything between 4% and 43% reduction in extinction just by changing where we do restoration. And with that, the importance of where becomes quite clear. Another major insight from the work, as we focus on all biomes, is that if we are to achieve multiple benefits with restoration, then we should be thinking and including multiple biomes. As we can see here, forests, as predicted, are the leading areas for carbon and biodiversity, but so are wetlands. And they can be even more important than restoring forests at a per hectare basis. All biomes have a role to play. Now, there are no easy choices. All choices for where to employ restoration will lead to different goals. There are trade-offs across these goals, but knowing about them in advance and having decision support tools that illustrate and quantify them can go a long way in providing decision makers and stakeholders to be able to perform informed choices. For example, if we are to focus only on biodiversity, the first map I've shown, and select 15% of the world, we would achieve 70% of what could be achieved for climate. Conversely, if we're going to focus only on climate when restoring 15% of the planet, the outcomes for biodiversity would be limited to 61% of what they could be. Now, if we focus on both of them at the same time when planning for restoration, we can achieve over 90% of the potential benefits for both at the same time. So it's very important to take the trade-offs into consideration since the start. Another aspect that was quite clear is that focus on minimizing costs alone yield very weak environmental outcomes. You can see on the graph how far down on the left the priority for cost reduction is. If we are to include all of these at the same time, of course, we'll have a little bit less biodiversity, a little bit less carbon, but massive cost savings as well. And cost effectiveness would increase up to 13-fold for the same target. So again, the importance of smart spatial prioritization couldn't be clearer. Now, another aspect we found on this study is a major scope for international cooperation. This map shows in green the areas that would be restored, both in a scenario where each country restores inside its borders and also where the world collaborates. But as we can see, the areas in green are a minority on the map. The areas in red are areas that are global priorities for restoration, but they would go beyond each country's 15% target. So if we all go individually, if we all go alone, the outcome of the decade and the outcome of the targets in the post-2020 would be limited in comparison with a scenario where international cooperation is implemented. We also looked at the conflicts with agriculture, and here another important observation. These are elements that can only properly be accounted for at the local level, and these analyses should always include and be informed by the preference of local stakeholders. But even on a global level, we can look at areas that we know they have substantial productivity gap. And again, if international cooperation is to be developed with technology transfer and assistance for improving yields, we can spare enough land for very ambitious restoration targets. So we show here that we can free up to half the area currently used for agriculture if we are going to be smart about it. So targets in the range of 15 to 30% are eminently feasible if coupled with a careful process of improving productivity and taking into account local stakeholders' preference. And we can still achieve a very large proportion of those global benefits if we focus on these areas. Now, ecosystem restoration has been touted as a key climate change mitigation tool, and we confirm that not only the impacts of restoration are substantial, but they are also very cost effective. If we compare restoration costs, if paid by a carbon market, for instance, they are well below current carbon market values. So the tool we developed, and here is an illustration of what we can do, Plangeia, we hope to support this process. And some of the conclusions that have been taken up, and I mentioned a few already, where restoration happens can provide massive differences. If we were to restore 30% of degraded lands, we could avoid up to 71% of species extinctions, sequester 465 billion tons of CO2. That is equivalent to almost half the whole buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And we can do that at very cost-effective cost. Now, there are major synergies across the Rio Conventions and even larger room for restoration than in previous global agreements. To complement, we also hosted, on the request of the CBD and the Post-2020 Open-Ended Working Group, a consultation in Rio in 2019. And some of the main outcomes of that went to support the development of the current draft of the post-2020 framework. So it was informed by parties' preferences and by science. And currently, at the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework draft target, we do have one of the most important consensus about all participants and of our research, which is a goals for restoration. They can be based in areas, but they should be outcome oriented, as it's very clear in the 4 long-term goals for 2050 as related to the 2050 vision. Now, there are milestones related to this, and in particular, the first one, the area connectivity integrity of natural ecosystem is increased by at least 5%. The number of species that are threatened is reduced, and the abundance of all species is increased. Also, nature contributes to sustainable diets and food security, access to safe and drinking water, and resilience to natural disaster can be a contribution of restoration. Nature being valued through green investments. Restoration has a major potential to attract green investments. Restoration can be implemented in a way that generates income and jobs and even financial returns for investors while still delivering environmental and social benefits. The first target of the Global Biodiversity Framework also calls that by 2030, we should have provisionally 50% of all land and sea under spatial planning. And that was very heartening to see the inclusion of this after the outcomes we found on the extreme importance of where to implement these goals. With that, I finish thanking the sponsors of this work and you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. That was an excellent presentation. And I think one of the things is it lays out some of the concrete recommendations to help us further refine and reflect the restoration agenda in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's also good to see the trade-offs between all the different agendas. Now, our event has gone a little bit longer than we've anticipated, but we are going to take a couple of questions and move them forward. We'll have a question for the Executive Secretary and then a question for Bernardo. I'm going to start with a question to Elizabeth Mrema, the Executive Secretary. Executive Secretary, can you let us know how the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, or FAIRI, contributed to implementing restoration actions at country level? And what role do we envisage for the next phase of FAIRI in the context of this restoration decade? So Elizabeth, you have the floor for that question.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me. Indeed, since 2015, the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat has been implementing the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative with the generous support of the Korea Forest Service. During this time, this initiative, I'll call it FAIRI, has provided capacity building, technical support on ecosystem restoration, developed knowledge products, conducted a number of outreach and awareness raising events, all in collaboration with many partners. FAIRI has also provided small-scale catalytic funding to restoration projects in 12 countries in collaboration with national focal points. Furthermore, the capacity development that benefited from this initiative has been facilitated through analysis of country dossiers provided as part of the organization of 7 sub-regional workshops for developing country parties to share information, exchange experiences, and review national commitments on ecosystem restoration. We have also recently signed a new memorandum of understanding with Korea Forest Service. So we actually look forward to continuing this good collaboration to support the implementation, not just of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework when it is adopted, but also to work in collaboration and contribute to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. We're going to direct a question to Bernardo now. This question comes from Adriana Vidal of IUCN, and she's addressing your presentation specifically, Bernardo. She says, what are spared lands or empty lands in your presentation? And she also wants to know, how was tenure assessed in this analysis, considering the presence of local communities and indigenous peoples? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana, for the question. Spared lands are areas that could potentially be spared for restoration if we were to achieve or to implement improvements in productivity. For instance, the reality in the Atlantic forest in Brazil, for instance, is over 70% of it is of cattle ranching, of which 50% is relatively low productivity and 25% of considerably low productivity. So if we were to increase productivity in these lands, we can, and previous research has shown, we can concentrate the current herd of the Atlantic forest in less than a third of the area and still be extensive sustainable systems. So that can be done on each farm. So the farmer liberates or spare a bit of land and do restoration in their own farms. That can be done in larger areas. So that's what spared land means. As for indigenous peoples and local communities, unfortunately, at global scale, we're not able to incorporate this properly. We even have some information, which is imperfect, on land tenure, indigenous communities and local communities' lands. But what we couldn't do at a global scale was a comprehensive consultation in each and every one of these local places. And we restrained ourselves from making simplistic assumptions, such as let's avoid areas of indigenous people. We had indigenous people representatives in our workshop in Rio, and they were unanimous saying that indigenous people can and want to be part of the efforts of the decade. But of course, this has to be decided locally, individually, which each of them do and informed processes. We can't do that at a global level. So we highlight that in the research, and we call, as I did in my presentation, for that exercise to be actually repeated with due process in every place. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bernardo. Indeed, the matter of prior and informed consent is an important part of any engagement with IPLCs in this process. Well, we have gone to the limit of our time. There is a lot of the decade ahead of us, but we're finished this first start for now. I'd like to thank our speakers, both Bernardo and the Executive Secretary, Elizabeth Mrema, for joining us today, and then also thank the ministers for their video addresses for our presentation today. I'd like to thank also all the participants who joined us today, demonstrating your interest and your engagement with this upcoming decade on ecosystem restoration. This next 10-year period is a huge opportunity for restoration, for the fight in the climate struggle, for the fight for nature. And moving forward to build us towards a future of life in harmony with nature. So thank you, everyone. Have a very good day, be safe, and let's get this decade begun. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, David, and all participants.
And let's get this decade begun. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, David, and all participants.